Before we begin this evening's program, I'd like to remind you of tomorrow's events, including a noon film and 2 lectures, all with a focus on religion and politics. The information on the speakers, times, and locations for tomorrow's activities are available in the brochures at the back of this room. Today we've been concentrating on population, and this evening we're very pleased to have with us a specialist in the General Studies Division of the Inter-American Development Bank. Robert Fox received his bachelor's and master's in Latin American Studies and is currently a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Florida. Please join me in welcoming Robert Fox.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to publicly thank Nancy Myers for this very nice flower. We heard from Richard Benedict, for those of you who were here earlier, at 3 o'clock, who gave us an excellent overview of the world population situation. I don't think he had much good news, but he kept smiling and talked enthusiastically and spoke optimistically. Now, I'd like to take you down the garden path a little bit and get into one area. We could just as easily cover 30 other areas, but let's specialize. Let's go from that general talk into one area. Now, this is the area I work in, Latin America, and the issue that seems to be most pressing now, and truly is, one of them in any case, and that is urbanization. Now, my objective is to give you an overview of Latin American urban and rural trends, pointing to the year 2000, with the presumption that few of you have much knowledge of the area. Has anyone been to Latin America? Oh, I may have to change this talk on the spot. I'm going to give you a lot of baseline information describing Latin American urbanization to inform you that we're dealing with a situation which is very unique in the developing world. 5 characteristics related to Latin America and pertinent here include the observations: 1, that the region has a much higher proportion of its total population in cities than practically any other developing part of the world. 2, it also has the highest population growth rate of any major region, and projections show continuing massive increases in the foreseeable future. Africa, of course, is now beginning to compete with Latin America in this regard. 3, the urbanization process is supported by a high rural to urban migration rate, but equally important, and a point stressed at the Rome meetings just, in September, when the mayors of the world's largest cities were brought together. But equally important, often the majority of urban increases now result from births in the cities. The issue of rural to urban migration is diminishing, in other words. 4, most national urban systems in Latin America are dominated by 1 or 2 major urban agglomerations. And 5, nonetheless, there exists a surprising evenness of city growth as judged by city size category, a factor that should have enormous consequences on the practicalities of urban decentralization rhetoric now in vogue in Latin America. I'll cover each of these points in some detail. But meanwhile, I don't want to forget to mention that there's a significant heterogeneity within the region, including differences in population size. Panama and Costa Rica, for example, each have around 2 million inhabitants, as compared to Brazil with 120 million. 2, urban concentrations are found in 1 or 2 cities on the one hand, such as in Argentina, Uruguay, Ecuador, Peru, Chile, and Guatemala, as compared to fairly strong city networks in such places as Colombia in particular, and in Mexico. And 3, there are vast differences in rates of population growth. And considering the drag of demographic inertia, there are great differences in the projections to the end of the century. Consider this: Mexico and Argentina in 1950 had more or less 7 or 8 million population difference in absolute numbers between them. In 1950. In the year 2000, they'll have roughly a 100 million population size difference between them. Now, I want to come out of this talk having made the following points. First, that the urban explosion in Latin America is the population explosion. That in spatial distribution terms, the growing urban imbalance is, of course, matched by a very stagnant rural sector, and that there is a genuine population growth issue in Latin America, which is accepted there not so much as a high birth rate, but rather as urbanization, and increasingly as an excess labor force supply issue. Now, the first point I mentioned was Latin America has a much higher proportion of its total population in cities than practically any other developing region of the world. This should surprise you. It surprised me last year. After working on this subject for a long time, I finally got around to checking what the urban proportion of the total population was in different parts of the region. I was amazed to find, well, let's look at population in cities over 20,000. In these countries, Sub-Saharan Africa excluding South Africa, Bangladesh, China, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, the Philippines, and Thailand, the range is somewhere between 10 and 20% of your population in cities over 20,000. 10 and 20%. In industrialized countries such as Austria, Australia, etc., we're dealing more in 50 and 60% range. Now listen to Latin America. In Argentina, it's 67%, Brazil 43%, Chile 60%, Colombia 52%, Mexico 58%, Peru 45%, Venezuela 64%. In other words, when we look at the population projections, as we will, keep in mind that Latin America starts from an entirely different position than most developing countries. In fact, the only region I can find where there's a rough approximation is really the North African tier of states. And I judge there, you live in the city, you starve to death, no? It's that or the desert. The second point I mentioned was Latin America has the highest population growth rate of any of the world's major regions, and projections show the population will possibly redouble in the 1975-2000 interval, as it did between 1950 and 1975. This is perhaps my major consideration in the talk, and I'll spend some time on it. You simply can't pick up the sense of the urbanization theme unless you funnel your address, I feel, through this national population growth topic. Between 1950 and 1980, Latin America led the world in rates of population growth. This is now showing signs of slowing, principally because of slight deflations in fertility rate. But massive future population gains are still assured owing to the inertia inherent in demographic structures, along with the increase that even moderate birth rates will bring. Now, in any examination of demographic patterns, there are very clear distinctions to be made among Latin American countries. And I'll try to give you an awareness of at least the rudiments. We have three groupings. The first group, on the margin of the region's generally high growth rate, are the southern cone nations of Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile. Increases in Argentina and Uruguay are conditioned by moderate fertility levels of longstanding that are heritages of earlier and predominantly European cultural and behavioral traits. To a lesser degree, this is also true for Chile. This ingredient, in combination with a high proportion of women in older age brackets, thus fewer in the high fertility years, as well as a high incidence of emigration out of Uruguay, has served to keep population increases moderate in this part of South America. Argentina and Uruguay, with 17 and 2 million inhabitants respectively in 1950, held about 27 million and 3 million in 1980. Neither gain represents an increase of more than 1.5% per annum, averages that are quite low in the Latin American context. In Chile, the increase was from 6 to 11 million and represents an increase of around 2%. And in recent years, even this has begun to drift downward. Given these low rates, one may deduce, and this is quite true, why the average Argentine or Uruguayan, or Chilean for that matter, Chileno, has little more understanding of the severity of the population growth issue as it prevails in more tropical countries where the rates are 3% and above than does the average Canadian, European, or U.S. citizen. This amazed me to learn in Buenos Aires talking to people. In Chile and Uruguay, they haven't the foggiest idea what goes on in the tropics. That's north of them, almost equidistant than the tropics are from us here. And the second marginal group are countries where the common characteristic of high mortality has been and is still the key agent in moderating population gains. Included among others are Honduras, Bolivia, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. Each is unquestionably improving conditions of health, sanitation, and medical attention. But the high mortality levels which prevail have in the past, particularly infant mortality, and will continue to offset the ever-present high fertility standards. This is your basic demography. Thus, Haiti's high birth rate of 45 per thousand, 1950-55, was offset by a death rate of 26, resulting in a modest 1.9% rate of population growth. Even now, the still high death rate of 15 continues to seriously offset the birth rate of 40, yielding a rate of natural increase of 2.5%. There's something of a tandem relationship between the two. Your rate of population, not population growth, of natural increase results in the measure between the number or the rates of birth and the death rate. As the one drops, the other drops somewhat in similar fashion. You have not altered your rate of natural increase. This is what's happening in Haiti and a number of places. It's a phase all countries go through. Apart from these extremes, the prevailing demographic pattern in the region relates to an ever-constant high birth rate and low death rates. This affects roughly 75% of Latin America. To be sure, all countries in this, the third group, passed through a period in which the death rate fell rapidly, but this event is past, in comparison to Haiti and several other places where mortality rates are still high. Mexico and Brazil are examples of countries in the mainstream of Latin American demographic events in the 1950-80 period. Mexico, the crude death rate dropped from 15 to 8, and the birth rate from 47 to 42, 50 to 80. The death rate in Brazil fell from 12 to 8, and the birth rate from 41 to 36. In both cases, the resulting population growth rate and discounting a negligible amount of net migration remained quite high, 2.8% or above. This basic Latin American pattern prevailed in the 1950s through the 1970s. It produced the population explosion, which in briefest form may be described as the period in which mortality rates, depending heavily upon imported Western medical, health, and sanitation technology, plunged sharply, while birth rates, depending heavily on slowly changing cultural norms, remained high. Guided by the high rates of increase among the larger countries, as exemplified by Brazil and Mexico, and supported by similar patterns of increase in such countries as Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and the Central American republics, Latin America's population rose dramatically from 160 million in 1950 to 375 million inhabitants in 1980. There's strong indications now that fertility is falling, but moderately, just moderately. The World Fertility Series of surveys found fertility dropping in Colombia by about 30%, smaller amounts in the Dominican Republic and in Panama. But yet even a brief pause in the knowledge that fertility levels are believed to have fallen slightly should not deter from the fact that large increases are expected in the coming years. Now note this. A population increasing at an annual average rate of 3.5% doubles in 20 years, but one increasing at a rate of 2.5% does, after all, double in just 28 years. Now the good news is that it's falling. Terrific. It's gone from 3.5 to 2.5. This is the good news we read. But the upshot is that your doubling time has simply increased from 20 to 28 years. Keep that in mind. Apart from an expectation of continuing high or moderately high birth rates in several Latin American countries, Brazil and Mexico among them, much of the expected increase will be due to factors built into demographic structures. We got into that a little bit this afternoon. The whole tandem relationship, as it were, between declining mortality and declining birth rates, and built into that is increased life expectancy. These are demographic structural issues. Apart from that, the fact that in places like Mexico, 48% of your population is under 15 years of age. That has momentum for the future. This is an intractable issue. Let's now look at the projections from 1980 to the year 2000. I use those from the sources available, essentially the United Nations and the U.S. Bureau of the Census. Both sources suggest that the Latin American population, and I think I've changed this a little here, numbering, 360 million in 1978, could increase to slightly over 600 million by the year 2000. Mind you, I made note to 150 million people in 1950, increasing then fourfold to 600 million by the year 2000. And in both of these projection series, the birth rate level should fall by about 20%, Should it fall substantially faster, however, this is 1980 to 2000, or by about 30% from present levels, as shown in the low projection series from these sources, the total would reach 570 million. In the third instance, in what is an extremely low projection, the population could total 525 million inhabitants, were fertility levels severely reduced to the point that by year 2000, each couple had 2 children on average. Now, clearly, it's not the precision of measuring a future population that has any importance here, but rather the notation that it will fall within a definable range, more or less, 525 million to 600 million. A number high enough to add a considerable burden to already overburdened social and economic systems. Now, within this context, there are enormous differences country by country in terms of the increases they can expect, attributable to variations in birth rates and demographic structures. Let's look at some of these. And I'll look at these in terms of the modalities I showed you earlier. Argentina, low births, low deaths. Population 1970, 23 million. Population in the year 2000, 34 million. Second modality, falling deaths, still high births. Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Has anyone been to Haiti, by the way? No one. This is an ecological disaster. It's overpopulated now. There, of course, is no such thing as overpopulation. Mother Nature takes care of that. But there is overpopulation relative to levels of living. There's not much on Haiti. If you combine the populations now, I don't have these separate, of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, oh, it's 1970 here, you have 7 million people. The projections show for the year 2023 million. Central America and Panama, different circumstances, of course. We're looking at 6 countries here. This is the second modality, declining deaths. 1970, 17 million people. The year 2000, 39 million. Mexico and Brazil. Brazil, 1970, this is a second group. Low deaths, falling births. 93 million in 1970, 202 million projected for the year 2000. And Mexico, 48 million people, actually 50 million when you adjust for census under-enumeration in 1970, projecting 129 million by the year 2000. The third point I raised was the urbanization process is supported by a high rural to urban migration rate, but equally important, often the majority of urban increases now result from births in the cities. And here we get into the area of the growth of the cities. The essence of Latin America's urbanization trend is found in the observation that practically all national population gains in country after country are accruing to the cities. Brazil, for example, added 49 million people to its population between 1960 and 1979. But those in the cities and towns, of that 49 million, 43 million accrued to cities and towns. Regionally, 117 million individuals became incorporated into city life throughout Latin America during the period. 117 million, as compared to an increase of just 20 million in the countryside. These slight rural gains are also concentrated in a very few countries, with largely indigenous populations. This pattern is fully expected to continue. And by the close of the 20th century, Latin America should be a region of some 475 million city and town dwellers, compared to roughly 225 million in 1980. There are 4 general considerations I'll throw at you that support the expectation. Apart from the inevitability of future population growth on a national scale, as I've just gone over. The first, which I did cover earlier as the first point, is based on the overwhelming domination of the urban over the rural sector in Latin America in terms of benefiting from disproportionately large shares of national investments and capital expenditures. The brunt of a nation's services are located in the cities. This is well known, particularly in the largest metropolitan area. Urban transportation food costs are quite often subsidized by the entire population out of general revenues. The urban bias unquestionably exists in Latin America. This differential treatment of the urban over the rural in turn enhances the view of the city as a dynamic sector of the nation. But this has been a feature of Latin American society for decades, and our present observation focuses on just one cumulative effect this has wrought. That is, there are high urban population concentrations that are much greater as a proportion of the total population than found anywhere else. This we reviewed much earlier. And the fundamental point is that the urban base in Latin America is broader and more firmly entrenched than elsewhere among developing countries. The second reason is, it's self-evident. It concerns the number of births in the cities. As the population shifts to an urban setting, an increased number of children are born there. Thus, in urban Latin America today, the large number of births are clearly able to sustain and add to a city's population size. Historically, cities up to the 20th century grew slowly, if at all, only through constant migration from the countryside, since the urban death rate was invariably higher than its birth rate. Any demographer can tell you that. Yet now in Latin America, the situation has been radically altered as urban mortality is very low, while birth rates stay high, based largely on the fertility patterns of 2 and 3 earlier generations of migrants who are now confirmed city dwellers. Urban and rural differences in fertility are also narrowing, based on the greater survival probabilities of infants in the cities, as well as a differentially greater decline of rural fertility, basic demography. Consequently, Latin American urban growth has really taken on a sustained momentum of its own. The third point here is simply that outward spreading metropolitan areas constantly bring outlying towns and villages into their orbits through enmeshing them culturally, economic, and what have you within the city's activities. I really hadn't raised this point as often as I should before, but I spent June and July, the better part of both months, in Puebla, Mexico, in that area. And you could see the process. 10 years it wasn't like that. The darn thing has spread out now with a new VW factory on, I think it's, one edge of town. It's brought several other villages into that orbit. And we're dealing with a good 10,000 people. This goes on in city after city. The darn thing just spreads outward. And then finally, there's a matter of rural to urban migration as cause for future city population increases. Millions have left the countryside for the cities since the 1930s, and this trend continues. Consistently, in country after country, the rural proportion of the total population has diminished each decade. Peru, for example, which was 64% rural in 1940, is 31% rural today. There are no exceptions to this trend within the entire spectrum of Latin American countries. Now, one plausible finish to the trend may be the eventual emptying of the rural population reservoir, as has happened in Argentina, which is now 15% rural, or in Chile, now just 19% rural. This constant drain on the rural sector is now beginning to yield population losses in absolute terms in numerous countries, including Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Jamaica, and Peru. Practically all the remaining Latin American countries are finding that rural population growth has stagnated, and absolute decreases can be expected in many of them in this decade. Underlying this are Latin America's agrarian problems that for our present purposes relate more to social and economic rural structures than to food and livestock production. Let's come up with a very brief list of issues. What are we talking about? Concentration of large land holdings in the hands of a few, the continuous partialization of minuscule holdings into even smaller properties, which is a reality for the vast majority of Latin America's rural folk, the absence of clear title to the land, the low wages paid to agricultural workers, the recurring periods of unemployment and underemployment tied to crop cycles, the lack of ag credits, the isolation of rural dwellings without potable water, electricity, medical education, or other essential services, and the rigid system of social stratification in which access to higher levels within the rural class structure is completely closed off. These are unresolved issues for most of Latin America. But the population has responded. They voted with their feet. They simply left, gone to the cities, where even the prospect of employment offers better possibilities. And for young women in particular, who migrate to the cities at a much higher rate in Latin America than their rural counterparts, this prospect is particularly appealing, especially in view of the dismal occupational roles and prospects offered by these rural and agricultural societies. Thus, relative to the performance of Latin America's rural social and economic system, population numbers have saturated these systems. You can go into rural Latin America and drive for hours. I drove one day from, in June, up from Veracruz to Puebla. There was nothing there. We stopped at Fortín de las Flores, and we met a guy coming the other way who was coming from Oaxaca. The first thing he told me, there's nobody there either in the countryside. It's deserted. But it's really not deserted relative to social and economic systems, not deserted at all. Now, when we study the 1980 census results, it's fully expected that the economically active proportion of the population engaged in agriculture will continue to slide downward and perhaps level out in absolute terms. This has been going on for 30 years in Latin America. But it comes at a time when a very practical manifestation of the much heralded population explosion, first heard about Latin America in the 1960s, is now bearing fruit. Those born in 1960 are now 20 years of age, and those born in 1965 are 15. Very simply, they're looking for work. What has been a 10 to 20-year period of socialization within the private family context has now become a public issue in light of employment needs. Latin America's rural sector, stagnant in terms of employment opportunities, is now facing the fact that there are 30 million youth, ages 10 to 20, in the countryside, 1980, compared to a much fewer 18 million in 1960. The basic response of much of the earlier group was to migrate to the cities. Since rural conditions really haven't changed, what else can you expect? You're going to see continuous migration to the cities. Now, I got into the labor force issue, and we'll just spend one more minute on that. This, in my judgment, is the most explosive issue the region will face in the next 20 years. It's not something that's going to be postponed. Even now, the demographic chickens are coming home to roost. We've discussed rural stagnation in agricultural employment terms. Well, we touched on it. And we find that future employment will just have to be generated in the cities. Statistically, projections show the rural labor force almost stagnant, rising from 39 to 46 million workers. These are projections between 1980 and the year 2000. 39 to 46 million workers. While on the urban side, the increase in just this 20-year period should be from 74 to 152 million, a doubling. Of course, the issue is the size of the labor force. Stated briefly and in comparative terms, the United States, in its best year since the Second World War, which is 1977, created 4 million new jobs. But Latin America, with 1/5 to 1/6 the economic base of the U.S., must, from now to the end of the century, annually create 4 million jobs, just in order not to fall behind in its present high rate of underemployment and unemployment. And does anyone with knowledge of the region believe they're prepared to do this? No. The fourth point, most national urban systems in Latin America are dominated by one or two major urban agglomerations. And I'll give you some quick statistics. I'll read to you, country and city, just a few of them, and talk about the percentage of the total population. I think this is a total urban system in these cities. Buenos Aires, Argentina, 54% in one city. The combined population of Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo in Brazil, 38%. Santiago, Chile, 56%. Mexico City, 32%. Lima, Peru, 58%, and on and on and on. I looked quickly at statistics for the U.S. before I left, and I think that if you look at the New York Consolidated Statistical Area, which is around 17 or 18 million, that represents something like 9% of the U.S. urban population. And here we're looking at things in the 50s and 60s and 70s in one city, and at best in two cities. The message here is this is a foundation on which future urbanization will be based, one in which a major city generally dominates over the entire urban system. But when we look at the projections for these major cities, in absolute terms, this task seems impossible. Mexico City, for example, is projected to increase from 8.5 to 31.5 million inhabitants between 1970. Pardon me? Couldn't you hear any of that? Oh dear. Okay, Mexico City is projected to increase from 8.5 to 31.5 million people between 1970 and the year 2000. This is ludicrous, of course. Anyone will tell you that. Now, these projections in my office were made in the mid-70s. The United Nations also ran projections in the mid-70s. We came to the same results, coincidentally within 100,000. Now, according to the projections made in the mid-70s, to attain 31.5 million people, Mexico City would arrive at a point of 13.5 million in 1980. It's 1980. What happened? The fact is it's closer to 15 million. This is the fact. Mexico City grew in population from 8.5 million to 15 million people in 10 years. they're running ahead of the trajectory path, as ludicrous as is a population of 31 million people anywhere. Now, this has led everywhere, one country after another, to the commonly expressed proposal for decentralization. But I suggest that this is much more difficult to accomplish than an outside observer